Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Good to have y'all here. Good to have you joining us as we're really finally diving in to Be a Jew Today by Noah Feldman. So glad to have you be a part of the discussion and a part of the conversation and to learn together today. So as I we're in chapter 1, the God of Black and White. Um, before we start, as I like to do, I want to see if there's any questions, feedback, responses from the first chapter before we launch the conversation. Yes, Esther.
I just want to say that, first of all, I really like this book, and I like his clarity and his neutrality. I also want to thank Karen for sending us the podcast, because it really it just gave me a sense of his how do I say his not his bias, but his personalized objectivity. I mean, he's being very objective and just describing what he sees, but he's also giving you his personhood as well. And I love that combination. And the thing that I really got from this chapter, because I tend to sometimes be critical, judgmental of the black and white thinking, is that it's necessary. You know, we all need the line to know where we come from. And if this line disappeared, we'd all be floating. And it was a very interesting way for me to frame, traditionalism.
Excellent. We'll maybe come back to that line and the historical part and the nostalgia that he kind of refers to. I think we'll circle back to that at some point. But Lisa.
Okay, well, so this is just, I guess, what Esther said, and I really agree. I do like this book. I think I'm going to learn a lot from this book about the full spectrum of Judaism. I guess along the lines of what Esther said, but a little different, is that I like the idea that he's showing us that we can question and have questions about traditionalism, but that without it, we would not only lose the line, but we lose like some of the richness and diversity of that Judaism is. And so it just gave me that appreciation for, having that end of the spectrum as part of the full range of Judaism.
Excellent. Any other opening comments? Stuart, nice to have you back, my friend. You're muted, but it's nice to have you back.
Okay, here we go. So just a little bit of a historical perspective, perhaps. So Temple Bethel has always been a conservative synagogue. When I was growing up, the rabbi that was there for more than a decade, Rabbi Mesh, was what I would call a traditionalist rabbi. I mean, I was in the High Holiday Choir back then, and I just remember walking into services and it just felt like exactly what traditionalism is being spelled out, I think, in this chapter to be. I think it shows how important the rabbi is in a congregation to set the tone and where that synagogue is. I mean, I would say my feeling is we are probably more towards progressivism in the synagogue today, Temple Bethel, but it just depends on who your rabbi is. So I'm sure there's going to be contrasting element in follow-up chapters to what traditionalism versus progressivism is all about. But I think we've been on both sides. Temple Bethel has been in both areas.
Yeah. Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, I
Aylin.
was going to just say, thinking about it from the reform perspective, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, the feeling that was traditional, but I know the difference between Rabbi Graffman at Temple Emmanuel and more recent years at Temple Emmanuel. This is something that's happening nationwide. So some of it is actually not just the rabbi, but just the time period. You know, times have changed as well as rabbis.
Yeah, I think that was the point I think I was going to make also, is that 1940s and 50s conservative Judaism is very different than 20s conservative Judaism. Um, it's an interesting question of how much of that has to do with the rabbi and how much of that has to do with the congregation. And as I like to say, it's very rarely one or the other. It's usually both. Um, I talk to people sometimes and say, I don't know what kind of rabbi I would be if I was, if I was on the Upper West Side in the, near JTS in a conservative synagogue there. And how I practice what I do might be different than I do here, because what the needs of the congregation are different than they would be up there. And so I think there is some interaction. I think there is some back and forth between the two. But I do hear you that, from what I have heard about Rabbi Mesh, I was not around to know him, but from what I've heard from Rabbi Mesh about him, he does sound on the traditional side, yes.
Yeah, well, in the chapter when it talks about some of the Hasidim and the dancing and the playfulness, that was not Rabbi Mesh for sure. He wrote one book, and the title of the book, I think, if I remember correctly, is "The Abyss of Despair."
Oh,
That sounds uplifting.
I'll tell you how playful he was or was not.
Yes, Barbara Brandy.
I absolutely, I also love the book, but I also agree with Stuart, Barbara, and Drew that in Bethel, in Emmanuel, change happens. What I've seen from this chapter is that in the black and white world, there's no openness to change. And in fact, one of the major changes that I read, and I won't get to the page right away, it was that now women from the traditional groups can go on to higher education. Women can take jobs. And so the perspective is that the men are still focused on, let me be in the yeshiva and study all day and do this and that and the other thing. So I think the big deal that's different between the world of black and white and ours, whether it's Birmingham or the Upper West Side, is that openness to change. Doesn't have to happen, but can happen.
Yes. And he does say, I happen to just get this. Like, it's near the top of page 37. I was flipping through and happened to come right across it. But that traditionalism can change, but it can only change slowly. And more important, it can only change while refusing to admit that it is changing.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, an interesting point. But I want to go back a little bit, because I think this is tied in a little bit with what Esther said of, the way we look back at our tradition also. And he addresses this a little bit on page 38, that there's a nostalgia that we experience in relation to the ultra-Orthodox. Yeah, there's two ways I think to look at this, and I think on one hand, there's a little bit of a false nostalgia. I think nostalgia is often false anyway. But we look back on the positive things of the past, but we kind of forget that there were some awful things that went along with that. We look at it as like, this is the way that our ancestors in Europe must have been. This is the way that it's been. This is like the way. I'm not fully convinced that this is the way it always was and always has been. I think it's a construct that that is based on the idea that we're embracing what always was and what always has been. But there, even today, when I was doing some studying, there was a section in Talmud which talked about how women's clothes, how you shouldn't be looking at women's clothes that are multicolored, and the idea that, more to the point, the fact that women did wear multicolored clothes and not just black or white or navy, but that they had clothes that were meant to attract attention, and that men, and there was a footnote that said, men often wore one color, but it wasn't all black. Sometimes it was purple, sometimes it was blue. It depended on the individual, and that they would often have some kind of embroidery in there. So imagining that, wearing black pants, a white dress shirt, and a black coat and a hat is the way we've always done this is not exactly the way this has always been done. However, I think what Feldman does bring up on page 38 is an important point that kind of bottom half near the middle of the page, but that somewhere in every version of Jewish thought lies the notion that there's a tradition passed down across generations. And there is something to that we do, what we have was passed down from our parents, and what our parents got was passed down from their parents, and what their parents had was passed down from their parents. And there was change and evolution along the way, but we don't necessarily see that. We just see it as, this is the way that I was taught. There's an old joke that I like to tell about the brisket. Diane, I think, knows this joke. Anybody else know this joke? So this mother decides that she's going to teach her daughter how to make like the family brisket recipe. And so pulls her aside and says, okay, well, this is what you do. Like, first you get the pan out and you preheat the oven. And she's giving her all, and she's like, when we're ready for the brisket, the first thing you do is you chop the ends off the brisket. And the daughter says, well, why are we chopping the ends off the brisket? And the mom says, well, that's the way my mom always did it. My mom said, like, you always cut the ends off the brisket. So okay, but why? She's like, you know what? I don't know. Let's call grandma and find out. So they call grandma, and they say, when you make the brisket, you always cut the ends off the brisket. And grandma's like, yeah, of course. Like, why? She's like, I don't know. That's a good question. That's the way my mom taught me to do it. Like, you'd have to call like the great grandma. So they call the great grandma and they say, when you're making the brisket, you cut the ends off the brisket. And the grandma starts laughing. She says, well, yeah. She's like, why do you do that? And the great grandma starts laughing. She's like, well, the pan I had was this big. The brisket I had was this big. So, sometimes these changes kind of evolve organically, but to us, it's as if it was handed down from to Moses on Mount Sinai. And there is something important about acknowledging our tradition in that way. And I think we have to acknowledge tradition in that way. Otherwise, there's no roots to the tradition that we have to ground us. And I think that's a delicate balance for a lot of us that are not Haredi, which I'm pretty confident is no one in this Zoom call, and most likely no one watching on YouTube after, is we acknowledge the fact that the tradition has evolved and changed over time. It has to. But if things are ever changing and ever evolving, then what roots us? What grounds us in a tradition? How do we stay rooted to something that has been passed down generation to generation, Lador Vador? And what is our place in it if it's always evolving and changing? So I'm just kind of posing some larger questions that I anticipate he's probably going to ask and address at some point, but I just want to start laying that groundwork here. Steve.
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit on the idea that the traditionalism is always changing. And just for the sake of this question, assume that I'm talking about the Haredi in Jerusalem, because they probably have changed the least. What is it that distinguishes them from a cult?
Look, I am no expert on cults, thankfully, I think. So, I wouldn't be able to give you the actual definition of a cult. But what I would say kind of broadly is I think they're not really openly trying to get everybody else to be Haredi. They kind of just want to be left alone and do things the way that they're supposed to do things. And they'll tell you you're wrong, but they don't necessarily want other people joining them. If you came in as another Haredi, you may or may not be accepted into their community because you're coming from a different community. And I think I think cults generally want to recruit more people. They want more power. They want more centralization of the leader. Whereas the Haredi community is like, just let us do what we're supposed to be doing and leave us alone. And, go do what we're doing. Just do it and leave us alone.
Also, you touched on it briefly, but a central feature of a cult is that there has to be one charismatic leader who is immediately in charge of controlling the lives of his followers, and they have leaders in their community, but as far as I know, there's not one guy who's like the Pope of Haredi or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, often there is a charismatic leader, and I on that note, I always find it entertaining that we even in Israel, there's not really a chief rabbi. There's two chief rabbis because they couldn't agree on one chief rabbi. So there's an Ashkenazi chief rabbi and there's a Sephardic chief rabbi because they couldn't even pull those together to get one.
I'm shocked there's only two, to be honest with you.
I mean, I'm sure there are people who don't agree with either of the chief rabbis and that they follow somebody else, but that's a different issue. Esther, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that I think the brisket story sort of illuminates the importance, and they sort of talk about this later, but of the meta halachic issue of the why. That if we don't pass down tradition with why, that some of those traditions become very rote and ultimately meaningless, and in the case of the brisket, kind of wasteful. But the other thing I wanted to say is in terms of change, electricity was something that they didn't have, in the olden days, and electricity changes everything. So there's no way that the existence of TV, the existence of the internet, I mean, if you look at Chabad, they use every technology that, and use it very well. So I think to say that things don't change, they obviously change, and it does maybe the belief system, they stay true to it, but even that has to change in some way by incorporating the changes in the times.
Yes, Barbara Brandy.
In response to Esther, the Feldman also points out the change to using rules of government, for example, using things of the First Amendment to allow them to teach the way they want to teach in their schools. So take advantage of change when it happens, and that would also apply to Chabad in the case of we can use television, internet, etc., for our own good. But I really wanted to say something about the brisket story, because Feldman also talks about the brisket story. This is the last paragraph, or the second to last paragraph on page 29, where he says, suggests that the universe exists teleologically for the purpose of the Torah. Now, I don't know how many of you, like me, had to look up teleological, or whether you've just skipped on by, but it means explaining it in terms of purpose that's served and ignoring terms of what caused it in the first place. So the purpose is to get it cooked, get the brisket cooked, and don't worry about the fact that you had to cut off the ends to fit it in the pot. So he's saying that's a typical black and white way of looking at the Torah, to look at what it does, not what caused it. That's my interpretation of teleological.
Yes, and he talks about that on some level the earth exists so that Torah can be lived out, and that we're only here for the purposes of fulfilling Torah and mitzvot and God's will.
This is something of a whimsical digression, but is this color scheme where black and white cookies come from?
There is a history of black and white cookies that I'm sure I've heard and I don't remember. Anybody know it offhand?
Research, yay.
So this is a good opportunity to offer a Hebrew phrase for your lexicon. It's a tzarich iyun. Tzarich iyun means this requires further research.
Right.
Or this
Dr.
requires
Google.
further investigation.
Yeah.
I missed the first couple of comments. Our children are in Israel, and thank God they're getting out, and they called. So that was more important. So I don't know if anybody, believe me, I'm going to tell you, I'm glad that traditionally I was brought up the way my parents wanted us to be brought up, because it was those connections that we passed on to our kids and networking that allowed them to get out 3 days ago. Anyway, thank God. I think about the Holocaust, and I wonder where we as Jews of any ilk would be had not the traditionalists been traditional and had those close-knit communities and had those deep ideas about their relationship with God and the purpose of their being in this world, because 90% of that community was murdered, destroyed during the Holocaust. But look at where they are today. And I think it has to do with all of the beliefs that strong beliefs that they didn't question, even as he says, a lot of it is rote, that had pulled them together and allowed them to continue to survive and build their families.
Yeah, and he does talk extensively in the chapter about the value of community and family that gets pulled in traditionalist communities. That it's it's a family structure and a community structure that we don't have as much in more liberal communities. And he talks like, so we drop in and out of community. We have this community, we have that community, we have this other community, but we're not really in all of them or all at once. Let's see if I can find it generally, but that there is a value there of having a community-based structure that actually has a lot more support for everybody else in there, because you're all in this together. Esther?
I certainly believe that Judaism does survive in a sense and is enriched on the backs of the black and white traditionalists. I have a question though, and I don't know the answer, Lynn, about whether, and there were, in European Jewry, you were either Haredi or you were not. And most of those survivors, to my understanding, did not come to America and Israel and become Haredi. Many of them were, maybe Orthodox, maybe conservative, a lot of them nothing. And maybe they kept tradition. They did keep tradition. So I think that they did certainly, we benefited from it, from that background. But the thing that concerns me, and actually it is not proven true, but that we become more diluted every generation, although I don't think that's true, because I think what happens is there's a rebirth of traditionalism. And that's what he's saying in this book. There's still a strong traditionalist segment and return to religion. While there's also, the rest of us still struggling with what we believe. So I don't know. Anyways,
What was the word you used? Denuded, diluted? What was the word?
Diluted, like diluted.
Oh, diluted.
Yeah.
Diluted. Anyway, so I don't know if those people, yes, they brought the tradition, but they certainly didn't bring the practice. I don't think. And I don't know, because I haven't researched that. It would be interesting to know how many people actually maintained, their religious practices that they had before the Holocaust, those who survived, how many maintained those after the Holocaust.
I think about that also. However, there still were those communities that modeled the traditionalists, that people could look at and see. It didn't go away.
The communities didn't go away, and the tradition didn't go away. The practice really changed.
Oh, I agree with you.
Okay.
I agree with you. But you said, but it's still, but however, between and among those in that community, the practice stayed. The ones that stayed, the practice stayed. It's strong as it was before. And sometimes I think that I'm glad that we have in our community a representation from the traditionalists.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I wonder, when you take, I call it the top level of I don't know, it's what, I don't know how to say it. They're very strong Jews, and their practice is strong, and it's obvious what their practice is. So we have that just to see.
Mm-hmm.
That gives us a model that we can learn from if we choose to.
Yes.
And Stephen talked earlier about Rabbi Mesh. And Rabbi, I think we had a conversation outside temple one night. And I told you that Temple Bethel is so different from the temple that I was brought up in, because I was brought up in Rabbi Mesh's temple. And, I liked that.
Barbara Ayland.
Well, I was just gonna say when lots of thoughts about all this, but when Lynn talked about the top level, I think of Orthodox Judaism more as the full range of things we can choose from that'll be meaningful in our lives. And what I recognized in my own family is in Reform Judaism, possible, I don't know if conservative Judaism will be the same way, but the idea is to sort of pick what's useful to you. But the problem is then the next generation only has the choice of starting from those things that were chosen by the generation before them. So then it does become diluted. And the day school served this purpose in my family to say, well, here we can come back to the full range, still getting to pick and choose. So I like to think of all the different aspects of Judaism, liberal and Orthodox, as being very important and really building each other up. Because, and maybe this goes without saying because we're all liberal Jews and we're not saying it, but we also are important to the strength of Judaism.
I didn't mean that we weren't, and I didn't mean top level. You said it much better than I did. However, also, we might not have that strong practice in our families, but what experiences will our children encounter at camp, at Sunday school, in a day school, different from ours, that would infuse us with a different spirit or longing for something, and they see, oh, I see that. That makes me feel connected. Good. I learn more from that.
Cindy.
One thing I did enjoy about this chapter is that that we're talking about the traditionalists as being important and with respect, because I think so often in our Jewish community that we are very judgmental of people of the Jews that are different from who we are. So
on both sides, yes.
On both sides, and that's my point. And that's my point, is that yes, I respect their way of life for them. They have chosen that. Is it that the life for me? Absolutely, I'm clear that it is not. But then on the other hand, I refer back to what Feldman said in the introduction about, there's really no bad Jews. And if we rate ourselves or our Judaism and compare our Judaism to, say, the traditionalists, and then we find ourselves falling short, that's problematic. So I want to, so like what Barbara said is like, I want to respect traditionalism. I want our community to be that open-minded and respectful, but I also want that respect for myself and how I choose to practice my Judaism. And so I think on, both sides of the equation, I mean, we don't want to set ourselves up for failure by aspiring to what somebody else is doing, maybe. But then on the other hand, I don't want to be judged for not living their life.
So yes, two things I want to say to that. In addition to, I agree with you generally. One is, yes, I have heard, little denigrations of, those who are either less observant or more observant on either side. And I've heard that for a long time of, oh, those people who do that, but in that kind of tone of disapproval. And it is, I think there is something to say, you know, how do we understand and respect those who are different than us? I think that's an important part of this. But I also think there's an important part where it helps us determine who and where we are. That, okay, like I have a better, hopefully after reading this, each of us can say to ourselves, I have a better understanding of Haredi Judaism, or as Hio said, traditionalist Judaism. I have a better understanding of who they are and why they believe what they believe and what this works. And as you said, Cindy, it's not me. That's clearly not me, which is fine. So you can say this block of ideas is not me, which helps in some ways figure out what is you. What do you believe? And sometimes it's kind of knocking out some of these other things of this is who I am not, that helps you kind of identify who you are. But along the same line is one of the liberal values that in our society that is being held up as one of the highest values is diversity. That we encourage diversity. We think diversity is important. We think diversity is valuable. We think we need more diversity. Great, but that also means you have to have diversity even when you don't agree with the diversity. And that means that there are people who are going to be on this traditionalist side that you're going to wildly disagree with on principle, but you still need that as part of the diversity. You can't just say, I disagree with them and I dislike them and I disagree with everything that comes out of their mouths, so therefore I don't want anything to do with them. That's no longer diversity. And Feldman does kind of point that out a little bit on page 36. He says, liberalism can tolerate a little authoritarianism and illiberalism at its margins. Like, if you value diversity, like you can have a little bit of this stuff that you don't believe in at its margins because you need it at its margins. He goes on to say that if it becomes a majority or even a plurality, liberalism itself will falter and fail. The hard question is whether liberals can, in good conscience, offer not just toleration, but acceptance or recognition to illiberal communities that generate certain positive goods, like belonging and fulfillment, alongside their illiberality. It's a hard word. So I think he's right. I think there is a challenge in that, in saying we wildly disagree with this, but we're going to accept, we're not just going to tolerate you at the margins. We're not just going to say, oh, like, okay, we need to have you here, fine. We actually need to say, okay, like we accept and we recognize, and you know, we might not disagree, but we're going to keep you in the fold all the more so because we disagree.
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's harder for us to do.
I think that's one of the larger problems that we struggle with. I guess it's culturally in our country, is that thinking if I don't agree with your idea is a bad idea, so you're a bad person. Mm-hmm. And I think we've come to that in so many aspects of our lives, and that's and particularly in this case, it's imperative to back off that kind of thinking and embrace all of as you said, embracing diversity is accepting those that are different without judgment. And we do a very bad job of that, not just in Judaism, but I think in our country as a whole right now.
And I think to some extent, Feldman points out why. I think he says, when he says, the hard question is whether we can not just tolerate, but accept or recognize that there's positives. I think there has been a long history of tolerating other ideas, but we're kind of done trying to tolerate, and toleration kind of goes down after a while, and we're at the point where we no longer tolerate. And if we can't tolerate, we certainly can't accept or recognize that we might disagree, but there might actually be some good in what you're saying. Sharon.
Yes, first, given our first time in this group, I'm really learning a lot. I'm liking the book. I'm learning from the book too. As to this chapter, in addition to a lot of things that have come up, I can't help but wonder what is the difference in the adherence to certainty in the Havarti group versus evangelistic Christians. So I'm getting a lot of questions in my community in regard to that, just that kind of taking maybe I'm reading it wrong, but taking a very clear, hard line, historical line about how things should be and what I wants. So I'd like some comments on that.
I think I'm unclear on your question exactly. Is your question about Haredim and how certain they are of their historical
the similarity,
truth?
The similarity between having a belief system based on certainty and not questioning, and the evangelistic movement that really wants to, I think, function on certainty and how things should be, and taking things literally. I've had things pointed out from the Talmud by Christians that they think substantiates their perspective. Is that clear? Is that question clear?
Look, I'll put it this way. I think the Haredim are relatively certain that they're right and that they're doing things the right way.
Yeah. As are the
evangelical Christians. And I do think, look, I don't think the Haredim are intolerant of questions and challenges. I think they have the answers, and if you don't like the answers, that's going to be a different issue. But I don't think they're intolerant of core questioning. I don't think they mind questioning within their community of whether or not the foundations of their belief system are correct. I think if you were a Haredi and you were to ask your Haredi rabbi and say, I'm struggling with these questions, I don't think he'd push you off. I think he would answer the questions, and I think he'd have answers ready to put that in, to address it. I'm not sure you get the same, this is more anecdotal, but I'm not sure you get that same openness in evangelical Christianity.
May I say something?
Please.
As the only Christian on the panel, the Haredis have a tradition that's been passed down. I think evangelical Christians tend to pick and choose New Testament verses that coalesce with what they believe. And I think they've gotten into an us versus them scenario, as has most of the nation. Either you're for me or you're against me, and there's no conversation, there's no listening. But I was raised Roman Catholic, which I'm not anymore, and that was at a time when, I mean, they knew everything and they were right. And here's a catechism, and you believe it, and don't think, don't question. Questions are dangerous, you know? And so that's why I love Judaism so much. It's why I love Lynn so much, because you all question everything and you do it in the proper way, and you do it with grace, and you do it with compassion.
Uh,
So
Another one of the biggest differences that I haven't heard brought up yet is that the Haredim are not actively trying to make everyone else on earth into Haredim,
mhm,
which is from what I understand part of the mission of evangelical Christianity.
yes.
Does that kind of answer your question, Sharon?
To a degree, I don't think I've phrased it right because, given the exposure I'm getting from some friends who are evangelistic, they do tolerate questions. They see but they're very excited and clear about the certainty of their beliefs
Mhm.
and their traditions. And seems like the Vardy are similar in that.
Yeah, and I think again, I think Feldman's quote on page I think it was 36. Move the page. Addresses that also. That on some level, getting outside of the Jewish community, I think on some level the evangelical community plays a valuable role in Christian life. And I am not an expert enough to be able to sit here and say what are um, the certain positive goods that he refers to, though I think they probably fall along similar lines as the Haredim of belonging and spiritual fulfillment. But the challenge is when they become a majority or even a plurality in society, then liberalism itself will falter and fail. And so,
Mhm.
for those who value a liberal values, that's where part of the challenge is how do you accept and recognize the positives in a community on that you disagree with, but on some level stop it from becoming a plurality or a majority. I'm not sure that's a battle we are going to fight as the Jewish community, because I'm not sure we really have the tools or the influence to do that. But I think that's part of where the Christian community is struggling right now. Lisa?
So, well, I just had something different that I wanted to ask about. Is that okay to?
I'll say before you do, Barbara Ayland, was yours on that topic?
Yes, it
Okay, so we'll
is.
Barbara, and then we'll come back to you, Lisa.
I feel like what Sharon's getting at, I mean, I have found in some ways there's more fundamentalist Judaism and fundamentalist Christianity have more in common than liberal Judaism and fundamentalist Judaism. I mean, and the vice versa as well, but that was sort of surprising to me. And I think, my friends getting to know people and being friends with people at Chabad helped me understand fundamentalist Christianity more, because there are some commonalities. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Lisa.
So I just wanted to bring up one of the ideas, beliefs that I read in this chapter, which I think I had heard before, but I guess I just want to hear your take on it, Rabbi, and how is this the common belief of Haredi? The idea that when the Jews were given or offered the Ten Commandments and the mountain was on top of them, and it wasn't accepted out of free choice, it was accepted out of mountain's going to fall on you and wipe you out if you don't accept it. And so, I mean, that's in the camp of because I'm just curious. I mean, do the Hasidim believe that? Because they're all so focused on joy and, you know, service of God with joy that, you know, that whole idea, you know, just seems antithetical to the way they live.
So I'll give a couple responses to that. I think my preface that I want to say is I believe it's chapter 9 of Masechet Shabbat, largely deals with a series of midrashim of explanations about the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And it's a long, extended conversation in Masechet Shabbat about that, in which this midrash he cited is one of those midrashim. I find it fascinating that this midrash probably gets quoted more often than pretty much any other, at least in like circles I'm in. I feel like I hear this midrash getting quoted super frequently. Very few of the other ones, which are much less challenging in terms of the revelation at Sinai, they get cited a lot less, which I find kind of fascinating, and wonder a little bit what it says about us, and those quoting it over and over. So I'll give a couple answers to your question. I think one is, do they believe it is true? Yes, because it's in the Talmud, so they believe it is true. So I don't think that there's a question there that they don't think that it's true. I think the challenge, and there's a class I teach Wednesday mornings on Midrash, and I'm trying to encourage this too, is that the challenge with Midrash is not really did it actually historically happen, but what is it that the rabbi is trying to teach by quoting this Midrash? What is the message they're really trying to convey? So here, he quotes this and says that there's a message that this is trying to convey. That you don't really have a choice in worshiping God. And he brings in the next midrash from Reish Lakish, and this is on page 28 and 29, that you don't have a choice in this. This is what God demands it of you. The world demands it of you, that you have to serve God, and you have to serve God in this way. Like there's no options other than that. And so, because there's no other option, you find joy in fulfilling your obligation in that way. A lot of us get upset because we feel like there should be a different way to do things, and we feel like, what if I had done this? What if I had done that? How would life have been different? Or, I wish life would have turned out in a different way. I don't think the Haredi have that problem, because they see this is the path and this is the only path. And so I'm going to rejoice in that path, because this is what I was created for. This is why I'm here, is to be able to do this. So I might not have a choice, so I'll enjoy doing it while I'm doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to rejoice that mountain was on top of me, but
and didn't fall.
Look, I think there is a point where, at some point when you don't have a choice, you just have to figure out what do you do with that? Well, what do? You study it, you understand it, you understand what it means, and you find the joy in the family, the community, and you find the joy in the way that you serve God along the way, because that's why you're here.
It's okay. Exclusive.
Other comments, thoughts, questions?
Rabbi, I'm looking forward to the next time we get together talking about women and how women in traditionalist Judaism are treated, etc. We don't have time to talk about it now, but I'd like to have more of a conversation because we have a lot of smart women on this midrash, on this Beit Midrash, and I'd like to hear their thoughts about women in traditionalist Judaism.
So one thing I will say briefly is I think if you ask a lot of the traditionalist Jewish women, they don't, many of them at least, don't see themselves as being deprived or treated poorly. They see themselves as fulfilling a role that is specific for them. And so, I've had women, Orthodox women, who are like, I don't understand this criticism. Like, I'm happy to do what I'm doing. I love what I do. I do what I'm supposed to be doing. I have a specific role that God created me for. I find my joy within it. And, I don't need to lead services. My husband can lead services. I don't need to do that. I have other things that I'm supposed to be doing, and I love doing it. So, I think I do think there's some, and Feldman mentions that they've made some progress in terms of women being out in the workforce that they weren't in previous generations. But many of them, not obviously not all of them, but many of them, I think, see themselves as this is my role, this is my job, this is what God created me to do, and I don't see a problem with what I'm doing.
Well, they just don't. Those are women who have made choices, and I'm happy that they made those choices, and they're happy with it. But there are, I'm sure, a lot of women who don't have the same opportunities to be able to make the same choices that a man would make.
So again, I want to send this back a little bit in terms of the previous conversation. I think it was Lisa who brought it up. When you don't have a choice, when you're told what your role is, and you believe that God has given you this specific role, there is no choices. So you find the joy and you find the spiritual fulfillment in fulfilling God's will in the role that you're given. And it doesn't bother you that you don't have a different role. So look, we are a little over time, and I know some people have to get going, so I don't want to. If we decide to come back to this, we can decide to come back to this topic. But by and large, there are kind of three things that I at least was taking away from this chapter that I'm hoping you might take away more, but at least hoping you guys take away these also. And one is a better understanding of the traditionalist view, but also an acceptance and recognition that just because it's not us, and just because we don't disagree, and just because we don't agree with it, doesn't mean it's wrong, it's bad, it's that it needs to go away. That there is a real inherent value that traditionalist Judaism brings to the Jewish people as a whole that we need to embrace and value. And along that line, as we kind of said before too, just because you don't agree with it, that might help you understand what you do agree with as we continue through this book. So kind of saying, I'm not a traditionalist. Great. So let's go see what you are otherwise. But sometimes that process of elimination can help us outline and guide who we are. And I think this is a point Feldman was trying to make, that our values are different than the traditional, our liberal values are different than the traditionalist values. That's okay. And, we can judge them on our liberal values, but they're not our values and they're not living by the same values. And I think to try to impose our values upon them is not necessarily fair to them in that sense. Yes, Barbara.
Just want to also point out that liberal values that I believe in are not without their own flaws and their own problems that are caused for, for society at large, for many of us. So
Yes.
it's not like we have the perfect answer and they're wrong, or they have the perfect answer and we're wrong. Different strokes for different folks.
Yes, I think Feldman touches a little bit on some of the problems with liberalism in this chapter. He not very much, but I suspect as we go, I think the next chapter is on progressive theology, and there's one on evolutionist theology. I suspect we'll be getting more into those as we go into other chapters. So absolutely, I agree. Yes. I think perhaps the best takeaway is, can you understand and judge the traditionalist community, as he calls them? Can we do that based on their own values, not on our values that might be different? And how can we accept and recognize the value that they bring to our communities and our people, even if we disagree with what those values are? And if we can do that, then we can at least be able to move forward in some ways. So, kola kavod, everyone. Again, no class the next 2 weeks, but I look forward to learning together on chapter 2, the God of Social Justice, in 3 weeks. So, be well, everybody. Take care. If I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom. And if I don't see you on Shabbat, then Shavua Tov and Shavuayim Tovim, because
Have a good vacation.
See you after that either.
Yeah. Thank you, Rev. I have so much fun.
It was
Take care,
great.
everybody.
Thank
Be well.
you.
Thanks.
Shabbat shalom.
That's shalom.